commentator for the Financial Times and the author of Time to Start Thinking, America in the Age of Dissent. Edward Luce, welcome.
Delighted to be here.
We look forward to taking your questions and comments and stories about the news of the week. Feel free to email us, 1a@wamu.org. Comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1a, and you can watch the live video stream of this hour online at the1a.org. That's the word the number one, the letter a.org. Let's begin with national security. A national security advisor to President Trump had what some consider to be inappropriate, potentially illegal talks with a Russian ambassador to the U.S. Michael Flynn has repeatedly denied that he privately discussed U.S. sanctions against Russia with the country's ambassador before Donald Trump was inaugurated as president. It was a claim that was publicly backed up by the Trump administration officials, including Vice President Mike Pence, after the election. John Harwood, what's inappropriate about these talks? Is it inappropriate? Is it potentially illegal? What exactly is the problem?
Well, I think there are three dimensions to what we've learned about General Flynn's contacts with the Russian ambassador. One of them, of course, is the issue of the Logan Act, which is the law, very old law, which prohibits a U.S. Citizen from interfering with the foreign relations of the United States. I think that is the least significant of the three. Very unlikely that he would face any sort of legal jeopardy for that. The second is the issue of his veracity. He had indicated to reporters that he had not discussed sanctions in these contacts.
He, Michael Flynn, you mean?
He, Michael Flynn, indicated to reporters that he had not discussed those. The White House then represented to the public, including Vice President Pence, that he had not done so. Last night, after this report that there were transcripts of these conversations, and he backed off that denial, the vice president put out a statement saying his assertion that Flynn had not discussed sanctions was based on what Flynn told him. That's a significant issue within an administration. And finally, the third issue is simply the relationship between Donald Trump, his administration, and Russia. This has been swirling over the Trump administration since the disclosure of the hacking in the election, the intelligence community's conclusion that that was for the purpose of helping Donald Trump. There are some nascent investigations of that going on in Congress, and that has the potential to be a big problem for Donald Trump.
Abby Phillips, this may look bad, just kind of on its face. Do we know anything about what the content of this conversation was, or is this just more about the fact that they had a conversation at all?
Well, the story is pretty clear, and it cites 9 different former officials who recently left government service who were aware of these calls, saying that the sanctions were definitely discussed, and several of them talked about it and characterized it as the sanctions being discussed in the sense that the Trump administration would soon be able to roll them back, or that the Russians would not have to worry about them once Trump was sworn in. So that is actually the most significant of the allegations, this implication that they gave the Russian ambassador and the Russian government a heads up, suggesting that they shouldn't respond aggressively to the Obama administration's sanctions in December, and they should rather wait until Trump was inaugurated in order to allow Trump to move forward with that. That's the most, I think, damning allegation in this story, and it's the one that has the most to do with the third point that John brought up, which is what is the relationship between the Trump administration and the Russian government? And I want to go back even further, because in that same context that Mike Pence was asked about these calls with General Flynn, he was also asked about the broader question. What is the nature of the engagement between the Trump campaign and the Russian government? And he gave very similar answers. To his knowledge, there was no contact. Now that it is very clear that the Flynn part of this is not true, I think it opens this Pandora's box. What is true about what has been said from Trump administration officials about the level of contact between them and the Russian government?
Yeah, Ed Luce, I wonder what you make of how all of these questions affect the administration going forward, U.S.-Russia relations, potential fallout from this. Is this just kind of more grist for the mill? Is this, in the larger scheme of things, not such a big deal? Where does this stand in the context of everything else in terms of this relationship going forward?
Well, I mean, I think this could over time become a bigger and bigger deal. I mean, when Abby mentioned the forbearance or implication of forbearance on the part of Putin to wait until Trump took office. That reminds you of Nixon and Johnson administrations in '68 over Vietnam. The Russia relationship is going to come very quickly. The sanctions on Russia are going to come very quickly onto the agenda as the year goes forward. They at the moment will last up until June. The Europeans now are the strongest proponents. Angela Merkel is the strongest proponent of renewing them and strengthening them. And it looks like the Trump administration, in a complete reversal of roles, the Americans are now going to be dragging their feet on it. And to the extent they do, this kind of narrative is going to get more significant as time goes on, I think.
And we
Joshua,
should be. Go ahead, John.
One more bit of context for those of us who are old enough to have been around and covered Ronald Reagan. Me, maybe Ed, certainly not you and Abby. The idea that the party of Ronald Reagan would have an administration that people wonder if they are too close to Russia, if they are looking to undo sanctions that were imposed by a Democratic administration, is a mind-blowing concept, and I think it is significant because within the Republican Party, that Cold War overhang is still significant, and so you still have a number of legislators who viscerally react against the idea that Donald Trump does not recognize this former KGB agent who is leading the Russian government is a thug, a murderer, as John McCain and Tom Cotton and people like that say over and over. And I think that is a particular threat to the administration, the idea that it could alienate Republican allies in addition to Democrats.
We do have a lot to get to this hour, but I just want to make sure we're clear. When we talk about sanctions against Russia, can you give us an example of like what we're talking about? Are we talking about economic sanctions? Does this have to do with nuclear weaponry? Like what kinds of sanctions are we talking about here?
These are sanctions targeting specific individuals around Putin, banning them from having international financial transactions. There are also sanctions on specific state-owned entities in Russia. And this list can be expanded by executive order through the Treasury or narrowed. The Obama administration has been steadily expanding the list of excluded Russian individuals and entities. And it's over the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine.
It's the Friday News Roundup with John Harwood of CNBC and the New York Times, Abby Phillips of the Washington Post, Ed Luce of the Financial Times, and with you. Please do share your questions and thoughts about the week's main national news. Comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1A, or email 1A@WAMU.org. We're up against a break in a few minutes, but I'd like for us to start talking about the travel ban that went back before a federal court this week. Yesterday, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the temporary restraining order against President Trump's travel ban. What kind of response do we think we're likely to see from the Justice Department, from Attorney General Jeff Sessions going forward? Is this the kind of thing that is a foregone conclusion to go to the Supreme Court and we're just waiting on that press release to come out, or is there something else we might expect?
Well, I think we can expect the Trump administration to continue to pursue this in the courts. I mean, they have options apart from continuing with the case, and the principle of which is simply going back and restructuring the executive order, or maybe changing it so that they address some of the potential constitutional issues with it. But that President Trump was pretty clear last night in the immediate moments after the decision came down that he would not want to do that. He wants to take this to court, and I think he would want to take it all the way to the Supreme Court, where perhaps they might have the best chance on a number of fronts, including just on the sort of basic front of whether the state of Washington has the standing to bring this case before the court. And that's a question of, do they have the right in the court to bring this case on behalf of the people who they say they're representing, which will include some folks who are not American citizens and perhaps some people who have never stepped foot in the United States. So I think there's no question the Trump administration is going to move forward there, but the fate of this ruling is still very much uncertain.
Well, we're up against a break, and we'll continue the conversation about the travel ban and more of the week's major U.S. news. Glad to see y'all sending in some questions about the travel ban. We'll get to that momentarily with Abby Phillip of the Washington Post, Edward Luce of the Financial Times, and John Harwood of CNBC and the New York Times. I'm Joshua Johnson. Glad to be with you. You're listening to 1A from WAMU and NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Brilliant Earth, committed to environmental and social responsibility with conflict-free diamond engagement rings, wedding rings, and vintage fine jewelry. Online at brilliantearth.com or by appointment in select cities. From 3M Health Information Systems and Verily, working to improve insights and outcomes across health delivery systems and patient populations. Learn more at 3m.com/pophealth. And from the Kresge Foundation at kresge.org.
This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. It's the U.S. edition of the Friday News Roundup with Abby Phillip of the Washington Post, Ed Luce of the Financial Times, John Harwood of CNBC and the New York Times, and we're looking forward to getting into your questions and thoughts about the week's top national news. 1A at WAMU.org. Comment on our Facebook page or tweet us at 1A. Back to this travel ban. I wonder about President Trump's comments about Judge Robart, the federal judge in Washington state that put a temporary restraining order on the ban that kind of started this whole process. It seems like the president's relationship with the judiciary is becoming a bit of an issue in this process. Some have considered it the prelude to a constitutional crisis, this concern that he might not be showing due respect to the co-equal branches of government. How much of that do you think is actually a legitimate problem for the legal process going forward, and how much of it is just kind of political bluster that doesn't really matter in the long run?
Well, I think we're going to find out once we go to the Supreme Court. And just a quick note about the point that Abby made earlier. I think she's absolutely right. Every inclination of Donald Trump is to go fight this at the Supreme Court. But it's interesting to me that in the last 18 hours or so, I've heard several Republican members of Congress say, no, don't do that, pull back, redraft the order. So don't know if that chorus will grow and have an influence on him. But I think the question that you raised, Joshua, is a significant one. He referred to the judge, dismissed him as a so-called judge. He called the decision by the appeals court panel a political decision, and then this morning he tweeted out that it was disgraceful. He has continued to express high confidence that, as he put it, even a bad high school student would see that he's right on this. If the Supreme Court decides that he's not right, how does he react to that? How does he talk about them? Does he, in fact, comply with the order? You know, when Paul Ryan was asked about this today, or earlier in the week, about whether or not there was a potential constitutional crisis here. He said, well, look, the important thing is he's complying with the order. We're going to see once that order is final if he decides to comply or not.
I do also think that one of the interesting things about how this week has unfolded is the degree to which the judiciary has exerted its constitutional role in this process. And I do think that will remain a factor. This question of does the judicial branch have the ability to review executive orders that deal with national security and immigration is a very important question. It is one that I think will be dealt with in the substance of the case as we move forward. And I think the judicial branch has to be concerned about maintaining that separation of powers despite the rhetoric from the executive branch. We are seeing this process move forward in spite of President Trump's criticism of Judge Robart and in spite of a constant, stream of criticism of just the idea that there is a check and a balance process.
And the president's own Supreme Court nominee made clear he agrees with the criticism.
Right. Neil Gorsuch had said that it was, I forget exactly what his words were, but basically that it was an inappropriate thing to do to just
demoralizing.
Disheartening.
That's it. Yeah, that it was disheartening. Let me get to a couple questions. Rita in Cincinnati emailed us, given that the temporary restraining order against this travel ban has been upheld for now, what is the point of Virginia filing a new lawsuit against the travel ban?
Well, it is. In the courts, it is often helpful for there to be many avenues of challenge for cases like this. And in this case, we've seen several cases in Boston and Washington State, elsewhere in the country, where attorneys general have weighed in on this. And I think once it gets to the Supreme Court, if it gets to the Supreme Court, all of these disparate cases will be part of the sort of evidentiary base for the challengers to the executive order. So the court will take into consideration what is happening in courts all over the country, at the district court level all over the country. So it becomes helpful for there to not just be one case, but several cases all across the country where these issues are being hashed out and evidence is being put into the system.
Mimi Liu tweeted us, if the Trump administration feels the U.S. is in danger, the most responsible thing to do would be to redraft the order. Admit it was done sloppily and hastily. Mark emailed us, my understanding is that the president's executive order still includes language that prohibits entry to the U.S. of even green card holders from the 7 targeted countries. Given this fact, the court had to rule on the executive order as it exists, correct?
The interesting thing about the Ninth Circuit's 29-page ruling yesterday, the most interesting thing, I think, is they said that the amendment on the green card to the executive order that a senior counsel to the president, McGahn, had put out did not have in any shape or form formal administration imprint on it. The president's name wasn't on it. The DOJ's imprimatur wasn't on it. And this, I think, bespeaks of one of Trump's recurring vulnerabilities, which his reluctance ever to admit to making a mistake. So, I mean, it was absolutely clear that the drafting of this executive order was sloppy, no interagency process, no expertise really visible in its drafting. And one of the biggest mistakes was very sloppily to include 500,000 green card holders. So the question here really is, does Trump learn from mistakes and is he prepared to admit them? And if he isn't and doesn't, this will go to the Supreme Court. He will ignore advice that John was mentioning from fellow Republicans not to. It will go to the Supreme Court, and he could be slapped down in a far more dramatic manner at the Supreme Court than happened yesterday in the Ninth.
Yeah, if you look at the opinion, it makes it clear, and I'm just looking at it quickly now, it makes it clear that the Trump administration did not offer any rationale that the White House counsel is empowered to issue an amended statement that supersedes the executive order. They didn't say that he is anywhere in the legal pecking order in terms of where he stands with the president. The order reads in part, the White House counsel is not the president, and he is not known to be in the chain of command for any of the executive departments. So basically issuing a memo saying, what we really meant to say was, the Ninth Circuit says that's just not good enough.
I would note one other thing, which is not a legal point, but it's a human point. This case could go to a Supreme Court that has 8 members, evenly divided between Democratic and Republican appointees. The Chief Justice, John Roberts, was ripped by Donald Trump during the campaign for the decision that he made upholding a key element of Obamacare. And given the fact that the president has so strongly criticized the judiciary and John Roberts personally, I would think that is not an auspicious thing for Donald Trump, especially since 4 judges have now looked at this, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and they've all made the same conclusion.
We've got more questions about the travel ban and the judiciary, but let's move on and talk a little bit about the U.S. cabinet that's being put together under the Trump administration. Betsy DeVos, Rex Tillerson, Jeff Sessions, and some of the more controversial cabinet nominees have been confirmed. On Tuesday, Vice President Mike Pence cast a historic tie-breaking vote to confirm Betsy DeVos as the new Secretary of Education.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative and the nomination is confirmed.
President.
And then on Wednesday, Jeff Sessions was confirmed with a vote that was basically exactly along party lines, with 1 Democrat crossing the aisle to support him. The vote came after Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell led an effort to rebuke Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. She was trying to read a letter that Coretta Scott King had written about Mr. Sessions during his unsuccessful run for a federal judgeship in the 1980s.
Mr. President, I am surprised that the words of Coretta Scott King are not suitable for debate in the United States Senate.
During his objection to Warren's speech, Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell turned a memorable phrase that has since been turned back around on him just a little bit.
She was warned. She was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted.
So is it the contention of the chair that under the rules of the Senate, I am not allowed to accurately describe public views of Senator Sessions, public positions of Senator Sessions, quote, public statements of Senator Sessions?
I wonder what all of this means in terms of the relationship between Democrats and Republicans going forward. There was this meeting on Wednesday with House Democrats trying to figure out what to do. She persisted, had trended on Twitter and Facebook quite a bit, so it seems that all of this is giving Democrats some ammunition, at least in pop culture, but does that translate to politics? I don't know. What do you think this means going forward?
I don't think that it gives Democrats any particular power, considering that they are still in the minority. However, I do think that it is part of a long-standing trend of just the reduction of sort of collegiality in the Senate. The Senate has always been a place where people were more able to get along. There are fewer of them. They are more used to working together in order to accomplish things. And I think that is going away very, very quickly. It is going away in part because it has been on a downward trend for more than 8 years, but also because Democrats feel very, very strongly about Donald Trump and his agenda. Their base feels very strongly about Donald Trump and his agenda. And I think that for the time being, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, is very committed to holding the Republican senators together in order to advance Trump's agenda and advance a Republican agenda, even if it means sort of swallowing some of the things that McConnell doesn't even like himself. And that is going to, just given the fact that Republicans have a 52-seat majority right now, that's going to create a lot of tension. I don't think necessarily Democrats are always or even ever going to win, but it is going to make fights much more vicious in the Senate for the time being.
And we have quite a few coming up. I mean, in terms of the nominations, I don't know whether any are going to get to the 50-50 tie-breaking situation, but Scott Pruitt for EPA, Andrew Puzder for Labour, Tom Price for Health. All of these nominees have deep conflict of interest questions hanging over them, very toxic sort of political auras around them in terms of the Democrats, and therefore I think they're going to be big rows. None of them, I don't think, are going to be blockable. Ironically, the one that Democrats can block, Neil Gorsuch, the Supreme Court nominee, has probably just improved his chances with the Democrats by standing up for the independence of the judicial branch. So
the one postscript I would make to that is that it is hard for the relations between Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill to get much worse. But what I do think we are seeing, and I think this is the potential significance of Elizabeth Warren and the Rule 19 issue, is that the balance of intensity has shifted to the Democratic side. You see the protests, and that makes a difference. We got a midterm election coming up.
I'm Joshua Johnson. You're listening to 1A. Jay emailed us to ask, I'm curious what the potential future holds for Trump's relationship with the judiciary branch, going back to our conversation about the travel ban. If, for some reason, we find ourselves in an ever more intense constitutional crisis than what the travel ban presented us with, at what point does the legislative branch step in to rein in the president if he decidedly ignores rulings from the judiciary? I guess what I'm asking is, how far Trump can go? How much can he bend the Constitution before Congress steps in?
Well, the interesting, most interesting historic parallel, there are obviously many of presidents taking on the judicial branch. There's Franklin Roosevelt with the court packing incident in 37, but the big one is Andrew Jackson. And of course, Trump is the closest example, I think, to a Jacksonian since Jackson.
In what ways?
Was president. The populist politics, the readiness to take on the establishment and to get sort of mass mobilization around that. But Jackson was overruled by the Supreme Court, by Justice Marshall, the legendary Chief Justice Marshall, on uprooting the Cherokee Indians and moving them from their homeland. And Trump and Jackson said, "Oh, well, now enforce your ruling." And Chief Justice Marshall, the judiciary, was not able to enforce it. And Jackson then went on to bring populism to the judiciary and support having elected judges so that they would be more aligned with the people. Now, look, Trump feels very Jacksonian on this. I think he's setting up for an assault on unelected judges, overruling the will of the people, interfering with national security, with the safety of the American public. He's been setting the media up for that too, in terms of terrorist attacks, that the media doesn't give enough oxygen of publicity apparently to terrorism.
Report on them fully, that there are some that the press is intentionally trying not to talk about.
Right, exactly. But I think the Jackson parallel with Trump and the judiciary is a very important one.
Go ahead, Abby.
I do think that this is where your question is right, that I do think that Republicans on the Hill do not want to go down this road. They have a lot of things they want to accomplish this year that will take a lot of political capital. They want to do tax reform. They want to do healthcare reform. They want to do, Trump wants them to do infrastructure. They have to find a way to pay for the wall. I mean, there is a lot on their plates. And this idea of fighting with the judiciary is just simply not seen as a good idea. And it is one that, for a long time, Republicans have wanted the question of immigration to be back in their chambers. And Trump has actually taken a very Obama-esque route here by dealing with immigration from the executive branch. There will come a point, I do believe, that Republicans will decide it is time to just nullify this fight, deal with immigration in the legislature where it's supposed to be dealt with by and large, and try to prevent a really potentially politically damaging fight with the judicial branch that I think will leave virtually no one looking particularly good.
Yeah, we actually did get a question from someone asking whether we're on the path to just delegitimizing the entire judicial system. I don't think we are, but just the specter of that can't be a good thing.
Well, and it's also not in the Republicans' interest. They're about to have a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court. Donald Trump is, as long as he's president, going to appoint conservative judges. And so why would you want to delegitimize the branch of government that you're looking to uphold your policies?
Nancy in Cincinnati emailed this question. I wonder if we can answer it really quickly before we hit a break. Is it possible for President Trump to withdraw the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court? If so, what are the consequences?
It's certainly possible. I think it's very unlikely. Neil Gorsuch is a judge that actually has a really great chance of getting some bipartisan support on the Hill. And I do think that this incident with Gorsuch, sort of denouncing Trump's statements was part of a strategy to help him on the Hill, and I think that's what it will end up doing.
Well, we'll switch the conversation on the other side of the break to the Democratic strategy and how Democrats are considering what to do under the Trump administration on the other side of this break. Stay close. Of the Friday News Roundup.
It's absolutely a success. And I think anyone who would suggest it's not a success does disservice to the life of Chief Ryan Owens.
More questions over America's role in Yemen, French politics in free fall, and why is the UK preventing President Trump from speaking to Parliament? That's next hour on 1A.
And from Audible, committed to turning any time into story time through the Audible app and audiobooks on subjects including memoirs, mysteries, and business. More at audible.com/listen. From Home Instead Senior Care, offering professional in-home care, support, and resources for families dealing with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, including hands-on training for family caregivers. More at homeinstead.com/NPR. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
Before we get back to our conversation, we'd love your help with a program we're working on about the Democratic Party. Many are wondering what the party's strategy will be to deal with the Trump administration and the Republican Party. What's your advice to the Democrats going forward? Should it resist Trump at every turn? Should it try to find some common ground? Maybe a bit of both? Or something else altogether? Leave us a voicemail, 855-236-1A1A. What is your advice to the Democratic Party? And by the way, we want to hear from people of all political backgrounds on this one, not just Democrats. 855-236-1A1A. That's 855-236-1212. You can also make a voice memo with your smartphone and email it to 1A@WAMU.org. We'll play some of your ideas Monday on 1A. Back now to the U.S. edition of the Friday News Roundup with John Harwood of CNBC and the New York Times, Abby Phillip of the Washington Post, and Ed Luce of the Financial Times. We still have time to get in a few more of your questions and reflections on the week's national headlines, so go ahead and send them in. 1A@WAMU.org, tweet us at 1A, or comment on our Facebook page. Speaking of the Democratic Party, let's talk about some of that. There were four moderate Democrats: Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Joe Donnelly of Indiana, and John Tester of Montana. They attended a luncheon with President Trump yesterday to discuss the Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch, and also to talk about legislative agendas. On Wednesday, a number of House Democrats met in Baltimore for their first annual retreat to dissect what happened in the election and strategize moving forward. Did we learn anything from the retreat or elsewhere this week about what the Democrats' actual strategy might look like going forward?
I don't think that the Democrats have still quite figured it out. They are still working through some of the internal, issues here. But I think what is emerging overall, beyond the Democratic retreat, beyond that meeting with President Trump, is this overall sense among the base, the people who elect Democrats, that they want a fight. They have been showing up in very large numbers at town halls all across the country, and that is not going unnoticed by Democratic leaders on the Hill. They are very attentive to that because they do believe one of the lessons that they have taken from Hillary Clinton's loss in November is that there's no substitute for genuine enthusiasm in an electorate. And what they're seeing out there is the potential for there to be a groundswell of genuine enthusiasm among Democratic voters.
But wasn't there
to capture that.
But wasn't there real enthusiasm about Hillary Clinton as we got closer to Election Day, especially, I think, after Donald Trump won the Republican nomination and Democrats began to think, oh, he could actually be our next president?
Nothing like the negative intensity against Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton, the reason she's not president right now is because a little bit of the air went out of the Democratic balloon. There wasn't enough fervor for her. That fervor is now mobilized against Donald Trump. You do have a difference by chambers, just as with the Republicans. The House Democrats are more ideological, more aggressive. One of the Democrats at the retreat set about to use an obscure legislative vehicle to try to force an inquiry of the ties with Russia and the Trump administration. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, has got some members up for election in 2018 from conservative states. So there's a balance. These are the ones who met with Donald Trump yesterday. There's a balance that they have to strike. But as Abby indicated, all of the drift is toward a big fight.
I think that Elizabeth Warren, we mentioned earlier the Rule 19 used to get to gag her in the Senate. Elizabeth Warren is generating more enthusiasm than Hillary, by far, than Hillary did in the presidential campaign. And I think to the extent there is a debate, which there is, about whether the Democrats should move in a more economically populist direction, a la Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, the kind of line that they're pushing, I think it's moving in their direction. And some of the critiques and the debates that are happening internally about whether there was too much of a focus on identity liberalism in the Hillary campaign and the Democratic Party as a whole, I think some of that some of those arguments against it are moving towards a much more sort of lunch bucket democratic agenda are probably winning.
Or pocketbook issues and day-to-day issues and less kind of larger, esoteric 30,000-foot stuff.
Exactly.
And I would argue that they have not quite landed on what that message ought to be. The challenge for them is that do they work with Trump on economic issues that will help them form an economic agenda for the midterms and for 2020 and risk helping Donald Trump become a successful president? Or do they just resist? And I have yet to talk to a Democrat who has really figured out what that balance ought to be. I mean, there is a very real risk that they could help Donald Trump be a second-term president, and a lot of Democrats are very wary about that.
And, to that point, actually, Andrea tweeted us, how do Democrats resist genuinely bad policies without becoming the party of no in the public view?
Well, the dilemma is the genuinely good policies. I mean, as Abby just mentioned, on infrastructure, but the fact that, Mussolini also had a great infrastructure program. So did Hitler.
The trains ran on time, yeah.
Trains ran on time. And so that is a dilemma that's possibly not resolvable.
But even that's something where I think some Republicans might push back in terms of infrastructure, because we're talking like, what is it, $1 trillion worth of spending? It could be an immense amount of spending, depending on how the bill is built.
Not of public spending. I mean, as it stands right now, these are mostly tax credits being counted as spending. This isn't $1 trillion. It's not a real $1 trillion.
I would push back a bit on my colleagues on this particular point. when you have the opposing party's president in the White House, you don't really have to resolve your conflicts. You just put that person as your target. We are now seeing, now that Republicans hold the Congress and the White House, they are beginning to resolve their conflicts. But while Barack Obama was in the White House, they didn't have to. They were unified by opposition to him and by opposition to Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump is a unifying agent for Democrats that will not require them to sort out populism versus identity politics for a while.
But there still need to be some policy planks in place. I mean, just this fight over the Affordable Care Act and what it's going to turn into. You know, Donald Trump has said in a number of interviews, I had thought about just saying, well, let's just let the whole thing fall apart and then we'll come in and sweep up the pieces. And then we said, no, we can't do that to the American people. Too many people are potentially at risk, you know, because you have to have health insurance or your life is at stake. I could see that being an option, maybe not a viable option, but an option on the Democratic side. You want to break it? Fine, you fix it. And then when all the pieces are on the floor and we can prove that you couldn't do the job, we'll sweep it up and we'll have this brand new healthcare plan that we told you we could build. Here you go. See, you never should have put this guy in the White House in the first place. It seems like it's an option on either side.
Democrats don't have to work out a position on healthcare. They've got a position that's in law that Republicans are taking saying they're going to take a sledgehammer to. A lot of Democrats think they're going to end up not taking a sledgehammer to it. I was in Chicago this week interviewing Rahm Emanuel, the mayor, and he said he thought at the end of the day they're going to realize this is way too complicated, way too risky, and do a few small tweaks to it and call it a day. Now, don't know if that's going to happen, but that isn't. Healthcare is an issue that Republicans have got to settle, not Democrats.
Interestingly, I think healthcare is one of those places where it's a perfect example of Democrats just basically being able to put aside their divisions. I mean, remember in the campaign, Bernie Sanders wanted to expand coverage, and that was a major division between him and Hillary Clinton. Should we just tweak the Affordable Care Act, or should we just make it a sort of more nationalized system? Nowadays, we're not really talking about that anymore, in part because Republicans are the ones who have to fix the thing. And everything that I've heard from people in the healthcare world on the Republican side suggests to me that that the changes are going to be talked about as major changes, but they are going to seem like smaller tweaks, and particularly because President Trump is very, very obsessed with how many people are covered. He does not want to preside over a country in which people lose health coverage. And that is going to be the driving force for what this bill looks like. And that is one of the reasons why I think it will end up looking a lot more like the Affordable Care Act than like something else.
I wonder also if one of the issues is about some of the Democratic leadership, whether you have some more establishment Democrats as opposed to some of the newer voices who are pushing policies that are a little further to the left, maybe even just finding newer voices who aren't the usual suspects, who aren't Elizabeth Warren, who aren't Bernie Sanders, but newer voices who can breathe some new life into the party. I don't know who those might be, but I wonder how much that becomes part of the calculus for Democrats going forward. Just new faces and new voices, just to mix it up.
No question. I mean, one of the challenges President Obama has put on his own plate for his post-presidency is restoring the Democratic Party, which includes both redistricting and recruitment, which are essentially hand in hand. How do you find candidates at the lower level to run for races, to build up the party from the bottom up? But the problem is that is a project that will take a very long time. It will take longer than Democrats would like it to, and they're running up against the next census in 2020. The picture is not looking particularly good for them.
I'm Joshua Johnson. You're listening to 1A. Speaking of President Obama, he seems to be enjoying his time off. They caught some shots of him windsurfing in the Caribbean, I believe it was. He was hanging out with billionaire Richard Branson. They posted some pictures of him online and surfing off an island that Richard Branson owns. Must be nice to be, it's good to be the king. How much do we look to Obama going forward as a North Star for the Democratic Party? Is his time up? Is he done? Does he get to take a vacation for the next year or two? Or do we see Democrats turning around and going, Mr. President, can you come back to Washington for a few minutes, please?
Well, of course, he's gonna be living here. He is living here in Colorado, just down the road. I think he himself has indicated that he intends not to be like George W. Bush was, not to keep his silence, that he will intervene on big questions if he feels the Trump administration is endangering America's national interests. And as Abby said, he will help rebuild the Democratic Party. He's also, of course, going to be writing his memoirs, which are going to involve reprising everything that happened in the last 8 years and why it went wrong. And I suspect the more went wrong in terms of who succeeded him, and I suspect the more he focuses on that, the more he'll want to retain a public role.
Let's also talk about something else that is critically important, I think, from the news of this week, which has to do with the Nordstrom clothing line of Ivanka Trump. There was some a little political dust-up about Ivanka Trump's clothing line being dropped from Nordstrom. President Trump tweeted, "My daughter Ivanka has been treated so unfairly by @Nordstrom. She's a great person, always pushing me to do the right thing. Terrible." Then Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway took this controversy another step forward right at the end of her appearance yesterday on Fox News Channel's morning show about the clothing line.
Who's been a champion for women empowerment, women in the workplace, to get to him. So I think people can see through that.
30
Go
seconds.
buy Ivanka's stuff is what I would tell you. I hate shopping. I'm going to go get some on myself today.
There is that hashtag buy Ivanka right now.
Go buy Ivanka's stuff. And that drew a sharp and unusual rebuke from a top Republican lawmaker, Jason Chaffetz of Utah, who chairs the House Oversight Committee. He said that Conway's comments were, in his words, absolutely wrong, wrong, wrong. Now, we're trying really hard on this show not to focus on kind of the personality-driven sideshow of Washington, because there's a whole lot of personality-driven stuff going on right now that's not at the heart of policy. But this seems to have finally crossed a line where a lawmaker has to say, actually, you're not allowed to do that. Is this a blip? Is this foreshadowing? What is this?
Well, I would say that Kellyanne Conway's remarks are not particularly important. She was counseled, as Sean Spicer said. Jason Chaffetz, seeing her as an easy target because it was a clear violation of rules against doing what she did from the White House, rebuked her. But what it does is it underscores the larger problem of the commingling of private and public interest with President Trump, the guy who, after all, has not released his tax returns, and who has continued to give the impression that he doesn't really care about the traditional lines that people have had.
And suggest that other people don't really care about things like that, like his tax returns.
That is correct. And I think it does not serve his political interests to sustain that impression and to keep that going, because I think at some point, Republicans will tire of it as well as Democrats.
And by the way, it's Jason Chaffetz. I think I said Chaffetz just a second ago. It's Jason Chaffetz.
To give you an indication of how deeply that seeped into the discussion, I was watching a NBA or a college basketball game last night. Bill Walton, the former great player, was calling the game and said, "By the way, during the course of his broadcast, I do all my shopping at Nordstrom." So you see, Chelsea Handler was at the White House yesterday flaunting a Nordstrom bag. So Nordstrom has become a little symbol of Democratic pushback against Trump.
And there's also, beyond his businesses and Ivanka's businesses, there's the matter of his hotel in Washington, which we now know continues to see foreign clients. And he's promised that those profits will go to the Treasury, but has, as far as I know, given no mechanism for how that's going to happen. There is, and over the weekend, I should say, the Japanese Prime Minister is going to be at Mar-a-Lago, which is Donald Trump's estate. They're going to be playing golf, likely at the Trump International Golf Club. This is a state event, essentially occurring on his private property that incurs costs, and we really don't know how the White House and the government are going to handle this. It is a big problem, and we're 21 days in. We have 4 years more of this.
And not to mention the fact they doubled the entrance fees for Mar-a-Lago to $200,000 after his inauguration. But we haven't mentioned Melania Trump, whose lawyers claim she is missing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to monetize being First Lady, apparently. And, if we talk about conflicts of interest. And
she filed a lawsuit in New York State. Yeah.
Indeed. So, I do think monetizer in chief is going to become a big and bigger theme as time goes on.
Before we go, Fran in Raleigh, North Carolina wanted to know if we knew whether the clothing line was manufactured in the U.S. or China.
We know that some of the products are manufactured in China, but I don't know about the totality of them.
Okay.
And I will say, since we started talking about the Constitution, remember, there is a constitutional prohibition against the president using his office to enrich himself.
The Emoluments Clause. Yes, indeed. That's John Harwood, Chief Washington Correspondent for CNBC and a reporter for the New York Times. Thank you, John.
Thanks for having me.
Abby Phillip of the Washington Post. Thanks, Abby.
Thank you.
And Edward Luce of the Financial Times, the author of Time to Start Thinking, America in the Age of Dissent. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks very much.
1A comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you for listening. This is 1A. This is 1A. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for checking us out today. It's time for the global edition of the Friday News Roundup.
It's absolutely a success.
I think anybody who questions John McCain's understanding of the military,
And I think anyone who would suggest it's not a success does disservice to the life of Chief Ryan Owens.
Said this horrible name. This is not a prison. It's a slaughterhouse.
Une forme quand même de protectionnisme intelligent. Les États-Unis, avec M. Trump, font exactement le même choix.
This government U-turn would never have happened without pressure from the streets, without the hundreds of thousands of Romanians outraged by what they saw as an immoral government decree.
Our opposition to racism and to sexism are hugely important considerations in the House of Commons.
CIA Director Mike Pompeo visits Turkey for high-level talks on fighting the Islamic State. Geopolitical tensions surrounding Syria see few signs of easing anytime soon. In Russia, two top critics of Vladimir Putin suffer blows, one landing in court, another in the hospital. And Somalia's new president-elect has an interesting quirk. He has dual U.S.-Somali citizenship. Joining us to help make sense of this week's top international news, Elise Labott, Global Affairs Correspondent for CNN. Elise, welcome to 1A.
Thanks for having me.
Mark Mazzetti is Washington Investigations Editor for The New York Times and the author of The Way of the Knife, The CIA, A Secret Army, and a War at the Ends of the Earth. Mark Mazzetti, glad to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Feel free to send in your questions and thoughts about the news of the week from around the world. Email us, 1a@wamu.org, comment on our Facebook page, or tweet us at 1a. There is a lot we could talk about this hour about what's going on around the world. Let's begin in Yemen. There remain a number of lingering questions about this commando raid last month that left U.S. Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer William Ryan Owens dead and killed several Yemeni civilians, including women and children. Now, despite these losses, the White House called the operation a success. Here's Press Secretary Sean Spicer speaking on Wednesday.
The raid, the action that was taken in Yemen was a huge success. American lives will be saved because of it. Future attacks will be prevented. The life of Chief Ryan Owens was done in service to this country, and we owe him and his family a great debt for the information that we received during that raid. I think any suggestion otherwise is a disservice to his courageous life and the actions that he took. Full stop.
Spicer was asked specifically about whether his comments applied to Republican Senator John McCain, who has been critical of the White House's response to the mission. Spicer did not back down. McCain later responded in an interview with NBC News.
Many years ago, when I was in prison in North Vietnam, there was an attempt to rescue the POWs. Unfortunately, the prison had been evacuated, but the brave men who partook on that mission and risked their lives in an effort to rescue us prisoners of war were genuine American heroes. Because the mission failed, did not in any way diminish their bravery and courage and a willingness to sacrifice for their fellow Americans who were being held captive. Mr. Spicer should know that story.
President Trump jumped into the fray as well. He lashed out at McCain on Twitter yesterday, saying that the senator's negative assessment of the raid, in his words, emboldens the enemy. Elise Labott, let me start with you. What do you make of all this? Is this becoming more of a political issue than a military one? Are we taking our eye off of what really matters in all of this?
I think so, because you've seen time and time again, and this is just another example of how the messaging kind of gets botched in terms of what the policy was. Listen, yes, there was this was originally an intelligence gathering operation. There were some reports that the leader of al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula was part of the target. The White House vehemently denies that, but says that the mission was a success because this intelligence was secured. And yes, it was. But in the talking about this, the mission was not a full success. I mean, everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. This was supposed to be an intelligence gathering operation. It turned into an hour-long firefight with Yemeni militants in which several civilians were also killed, including, by the way, the 8-year-old daughter of the killed former member of AQLP, an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki.
You mean al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula?
AQAP, al-Qaeda
right.
in the Arab Peninsula, that's right. And so, instead of the White House saying, listen, we did secure some things, some civilians were killed, we're sorry about that, and kind of just having a more balanced message, this becomes a he said, she says of whether the mission was a success. Also, there are a lot of questions about how the decision was made to go after this raid. Now, to be fair, this was something that was being discussed during the Obama administration. President Obama punted to President Trump on this particular mission because it wasn't ready for the operation wasn't ripe at that point. But it does look as if there was not a deliberate interagency process before this this was done. It was done in a meeting and a dinner between President Trump, Defense Secretary Mattis, and a few other aides. And it seems as if this was like a hastily arranged decision.
Mark Mazzetti, remind us what's at stake in Yemen. Why is Yemen such an important country to the U.S. right now for geopolitical reasons?
Well, it has been for some years, primarily because of the concern over terrorism coming out of Yemen. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula several years ago was seen as the preeminent threat to the United States in terms of carrying out attacks on the United States. So the Obama administration really launched a clandestine war in Yemen, primarily with drones, to go after Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And there have been American and Emirati troops on the ground to go after AQAP. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. There's also this other aspect of the civil war in Yemen, which is the Saudi Arabian military and other Arab militaries are bombing Shiite militia who have taken over in the capital. And the Obama administration lent its support to that operation, which has not gone well by any means. And it certainly seems as if the Trump administration will continue that as well. So it's sort of layers of complexity, all leading up to this idea that, there's overall chaos in Yemen. The threat of terrorism really isn't getting any better. And I wanted to make a sort of other point on Sean Spicer's comments, and it really gets to, I think, how the military operates. The idea that you would suppress dissent or suppress criticism of an operation in order to honor fallen troops. In the military's view, that only leads to more fallen troops. If you don't look at an operation, if you automatically declare it a success, you don't learn, and you are going to have disasters in the future. So this is just how the military operates, and that's what I think is one of the big points of the week.
It's the global edition of the Friday News Roundup with Elise Labott of CNN, Mark Mazzetti of the New York Times, and let's add one more voice to the conversation. Joining us now is Anne McElvoy, senior editor of The Economist and editor of Economist Radio. She joins us from London. Anne McElvoy, welcome to 1A.
Hello, very pleased to be with you.
Glad to have you. Could I ask you also to chime in on your thoughts on the political fallout from this raid in Yemen? What do you think this means for the administration going forward?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? This is really the first outing that we've seen among all the heat and light that surrounded the first days of Donald Trump. In a way, it's a very classic argument. I speak here as a former war correspondent. I've covered Yemen a bit in the past. It's exactly the sort of argument that the White House faces when something is done. It may or may not have been a hasty intervention, but I think we all understand the situation on the ground in Yemen is getting very serious indeed, and external players are having to make difficult choices in real time. So along many with the other controversies that Donald Trump sometimes seems to set off all by himself, this is a genuine one. When is something declared a success and when is it declared a failure? I mean, like your guest who was speaking just before me, I do think it's very odd to say we cannot have a critical engagement or outright criticism of something that happened because it would be a disservice to the life of a serviceman. That is clearly a bad idea.
Let's shift gears to Syria for a moment. There's plenty to talk about, and we may yet come back to Yemen a little bit later as the hour goes on. But let's shift gears to Syria before we hit our first break. Despite a ceasefire that was reached in December, Syria remains the target of a great deal of violence. Right now, the eyes seem to be trained on the northern city of Al-Bab, one of the so-called Islamic State's last enclaves in the country. The Syrian army and pro-government militias backed by Russia and Syrian rebels backed by Turkey are converging on Al-Bab. They are sworn enemies. What, I wonder, does this sort of battle reveal, Elise, about the war now? This is a turning point, or was this to be expected?
I don't know if it's a turning point, but it's certainly an interesting development that what you see right now are different factions in Syria jockeying for the Trump administration's patronage, if you will. Okay, there's been a lot of discussions between the Russians and the Trump administration on what to do to Syria. In Syria, President Trump during the campaign had talked about kind of teaming up with Russia in Syria. You've also seen since his election, President Trump and Turkey's President Erdogan try to work closer together. President Erdogan doesn't want to continue the Obama administration's support for the Kurds. The Obama administration thought the Kurds were the most effective partner on the ground. Now that President Trump is in, President Erdogan is trying to say, look, the Turks could take care of that. You also have the Syrian opposition who has heard President Trump say he might end support for the opposition. So now you have the FSA going after al-Bab, and everyone's trying to say, I'm the most effective partner. You should team up with me.
Well, we'll continue this conversation about Syria and the rest of the world's global headlines on the other side of this break with Elise Labott of CNN, Mark Mazzetti of The New York Times, and Ann McElvoy of The Economist. Do send in your questions and thoughts, 1a@wamu.org, comment on our Facebook page, or tweet us at 1a. I'm Joshua Johnson. Glad to be with you. You're listening to 1A from WAMU and NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR member stations and from Fidelity, offering wealth planning using a personal, dedicated relationship to help clients build, manage, and preserve their family's wealth. Learn more at fidelity.com/wealth. Fidelity Brokerage Services. From Home Instead Senior Care, committed to helping senior loved ones remain at home as they age. Professional caregivers help with bathing, driving, and overnight stays at homeinstead.com/NPR. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
It's the global edition of 1A's Friday News Roundup. I'm Joshua Johnson, joined by Elise Labott of CNN, Mark Mazzetti of The New York Times, Ann McElvoy of The Economist, and with you. Send in your questions and thoughts about the week's top international stories, 1a@wamu.org, tweet us at 1a, or comment on our Facebook page. Let's stay with Syria for just a moment. Less than 48 hours after a phone call between President Trump and the Turkish leader, President Erdogan, CIA head Mike Pompeo arrived in Ankara to discuss all things Islamic State and Syrian war. This is the CIA chief's first overseas visit in this capacity. What do we know about the visit? What does it tell us about where America's priorities are right now?
Well, I think that as we've been saying, I mean, this is definitely an effort by both Turkey and the Trump administration to kind of reset the relationship after what was seen as a rocky relationship between President Obama and President Erdogan over a couple of things. As we've said, the U.S. support for the Kurds. The Turks see the Kurds as an existential threat and do not want the U.S. working with the Kurds in Syria because he thinks that gives the Kurds an upper hand, not just in Turkey, but on the border. And then there's also the issue of Fethullah Gulen, whose movement is very strong in Turkey and who Turkey blames for the attempted failed coup last year. And they want the extradition of Mr. Gulen from the United States to Turkey. And the Obama administration wanted that to go through the courts. So in this conversation between President Trump and President Erdogan, he's trying to, get President Trump to go more towards his way. And the fact that CIA Director Pompeo is headed out there, that's an effort to work more closely in Syria. I think you're going to see the Turks and the U.S. work more closely together. Whether that means the U.S. is going to end its support for the Kurds, we don't know. But certainly the Trump administration sees Turkey as an important ally as they say they want to increase the fight against ISIS to really root them out.
And there's another interesting element of the relationship, of course, where under the Obama administration, the CIA has been arming the Free Syrian Army, what so-called moderate rebels, a covert program to try to oust President Assad. That dynamic has completely changed now that President Trump is in office. He has not only suggested that this program should end, in other words, President Assad is more of an ally than an enemy against terrorism. Obviously, the CIA operation was directly in confrontation with Russia and Russian forces inside of Syria. So the Pompeo visit in Turkey is fascinating, if only to ask also the question: what is the future of this program? Presumably, the future is not very long for this program because it flies in the face of what President Trump has wanted to do in Syria.
I wonder also what the future of the relationship with Assad looks like. In light of a report that came out this week from the human rights group Amnesty International, it contends that the al-Assad government secretly executed between 5,000 and 13,000 people in one prison over the course of 4 years as part of its campaign to eliminate opposition to his rule. Somewhere between 5,000 and 13,000 people.
Even the lower end is completely unthinkable, right?
5,000 people. So does this change things, shake things at all, or is this just kind of more evidence for what we already knew about al-Assad and doesn't really move the needle?
I don't think it really moves the needle.
Can I just jump in
yeah,
there if
please.
I could
Go ahead,
from
Anne.
London? Hi. One of the things I think is very fascinating here is this sort of a return in Donald Trump's view of how to handle both Erdogan and Vladimir Putin, and these things are closely connected, to a kind of old school balance of power politics. I don't think he will, and I don't mean to sound callous about this, but I don't really think he will care very much about those shocking figures that you mentioned about the way that Assad has run and helped ruin Syria. I think he will double down on the play that he is making, that he can improve relationships with Erdogan. One of the things he'll be saying to world leaders as he goes around is, I really don't care. I know that some of these people are awful. I'm going to be transactional about it. And you, Barack Obama, and all you good Democrat liberals, you got this all wrong. You didn't make pragmatic relationships with these people. Now, our cover at The Economist this week on the grand bargain with Russia and all that flows from it on Syria and elsewhere says this is not a good idea. And there are many reasons why, mainly that the people themselves on the other side are not reliable when it comes to that kind of deal making. But one has to say, I mean, people say Donald Trump doesn't know what he's doing, but I think he's very clear about the direction that he wants to take his foreign policy. And whether we like it or not, this is it.
Yeah, and I would not. I would agree that I would not expect, even more revelations about Assad's butchery, which the world didn't need more evidence of, will have any real change in the view at the White House on the dynamics.
It didn't have any change of the view at the White House of the Obama administration. So certainly now that the Trump administration seems to want to kind of work more closely with Russia, I don't think that will have anything to do with it. I think what's really interesting, as we were discussing during the break, is Turkey's kind of change in attitude. Turkey was one of the kind of staunchest supporters of getting rid of Assad. And since And in fact, it was kind of a product of the tense relationship between the U.S. and Turkey. Turkey moved a little bit closer to Russia. You saw President Putin visit Ankara, and then you saw Turkey kind of change its tune. So now that Turkey is even backing away from the whole Assad must go, I think it's very unlikely that you're going to hear anything from the Trump administration, because you've heard President Trump during the campaign say, President Assad, yeah, he's not a good guy, but he's going after ISIS, and that's what we need. The Syrian opposition is not the priority. Going after ISIS is the priority. Although, lots of people, including in the United States government serving right now, do think that President Assad is a magnet for ISIS.
I think if you're just looking at Syria, one of the big questions we're going to have to look at going forward is the sort of inherent contradiction of the policy of who's backing whom inside Syria, right? Mm-hmm. So you have Russia backing Assad, you have Iran backing Assad. Mm-hmm. President Trump has shown inclination, obviously, to be supportive of Russia and of Assad,
but wanting to counter Iran.
But wanting to counter Iran. So what gives, and what's the push going forward? Is there some push to try to get Putin to give up Assad or just distance himself, or even more significantly on Iran?
Yeah.
That's one thing that the Trump administration seems determined to do is be quite hawkish on Iran. So there's a contradiction there.
Although also, the idea of trying to do anything about the Assad regime, it always seems to come down to boots on the ground. Like, is the United States actually willing? Like, how far are we willing to push if we wanted to say, you know what, President al-Assad, you have to go. You're a dictator. You're a bully. The world is better off without you. I don't know that the political will exists in the U.S. to really involve ourselves.
No,
and
it's inconceivable now that would ever happen.
It was inconceivable during the Obama administration. And, I've been talking to some diplomats now about this whole question of Assad. And one diplomat looked at me and said, listen, the United Nations kind of agreed, months ago, if not a year ago, that Assad isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So you can talk about a distant political process in which there's more consideration given to some moderate forces, but that means that you keep Assad in place, even if he's, ruling a rump state where he doesn't have that much control over much of the territory.
Let me get to a question. Go ahead, Ann. Ann, go ahead.
Very, very quick one on that. What we don't know, as we do know, and the United Nations effectively underwrote the point, that the boots on the ground period ended, at least for the foreseeable future, I think, for America in the wake of Iraq and to an extent Afghanistan. It was replaced effectively by the drone era, and it was quite convenient, and it was possibly a response to public opinion, but it also kind of fitted the Obama view of the world, that you wanted to be involved in it, try to do the right thing, support some people and do what was necessary against the bad guys, but you didn't want to kind of get your own hands too dirty about it or take too many risks in terms of public opinion at home. What we don't know is, where does Donald Trump, where does his administration take that instinct? I don't even really know what the concrete examples will be yet. I think you're absolutely right on Assad. I think the view is leave him there and try to deal with it in some way. But I cannot see America going back to a boots on the ground model. I do want to know, however, a bit more from the administration. Is there a continuation of that thinking about the use of sort of third-party involvement in conflicts, or is it simply about sitting down with Vladimir Putin and drawing lines on maps and saying, this bit is yours, your sphere of influence, we're not going to interfere there? That would really, I think, put quite a lot in jeopardy.
I wonder if we take a step back to Yemen and answer a question from Nasreen in Cincinnati. Nasreen emailed us, will this ill-planned, botched raid in Yemen become Trump's Benghazi? This was not a successful mission by any stretch of the imagination, and it is a disservice not to acknowledge Trump's failure.
I think if it were to become a Benghazi, there would have to be some political will to turn it into a Benghazi. I mean, Benghazi was the sort of confluence of a disastrous attack, death of Americans, and then a determined effort by the Republican Party to keep it in the news, to form a commission to try to tie it to Hillary Clinton. it's unclear and probably unlikely that the Democratic Party would try to make so much hay of it again because of this question of are you using the death of Americans to politicize things? And there are questions, of course, then there will be questions going forward about, maybe there were some successes in the raid. Maybe the intelligence that was gained has value. We don't know all the answers yet.
But I mean, also, look, a couple of things here. First of all, this was a raid that was planned, that predated the Trump administration. They kind of executed what President Obama started. These things, you plan these things, and you know that the raid, for instance, against Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, they were watching him for a long time. So this wasn't operational until the Trump administration. I think there's more questions, less about whether the raid was a success or not. Sometimes raids, they're not. U.S. military knows when they go in that there's always a chance
that it won't work.
Not that it won't work, but that, military officers will be killed in action. And that's why there's so much respect in this country for the military service, because these people are risking their lives to keep America safe. However, I think that there are more questions about the way that this was kind of decided, the lack of a deliberative process and discussion in the Situation Room, that this was kind of done, yes, with Defense Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman, but also, at a dinner with President Trump and Steve Bannon, and, a little bit less of the kind of deliberative process you'd like to see. So if we continue to see a pattern of that, I think that will be the issue, as opposed to whether, a U.S. military officer got killed, which often is the case. Listen, not every U.S. operation is going to be a total success, and they did get some intelligence out of it.
I'm Joshua Johnson. You're listening to 1A. Sorry to interrupt you there, Ann. Go ahead.
Don't worry, you have to. So it is a little
Structure
hard
radio.
with all this big Atlantic thing between us. Due process is going to be really the very interesting point. We know that Donald Trump doesn't like due process. He likes to, its foreign policy is as likely to be announced in a tweet as it is in a long and considered document. People are going to have to get used to that. They will fault it, but that is the way that he rolls. But one of the things, having sat through the many inquiries here into Iraq and particularly the Blair government's handling of Iraq, if you are seen to have tried to do a due process, I think it always gives you a better explanation of what you were doing. Even if things go wrong, even if people are killed in combat, it is always better to have had some sort of way in which people feel that it was done in a considered manner. And that, I think, will be a real challenge for Trump. I say that not at all just in in any sense of wanting to get people are sneering too much really about Trump and foreign policy. What he does is important, even if he does it in the way that some people don't like. This is going to have to be worked on, because otherwise he will make a rod for his own back, and he will find that people are caught up with criticizing him over process instead of looking at whether, in the end, was there a defense of this raid. Probably there was, but that's going to have to get a lot clearer.
I wonder if we could shift to Russia for just a moment. We're up against a break in a few minutes, and I do want to... Russia has come up a number of times in terms of President Trump's international dealings. We're learning a little bit more about the president's first phone conversation with Vladimir Putin. According to a report from Reuters, Donald Trump denounced a treaty called the New START Treaty, which caps the amount of nuclear warheads and intercontinental ballistic missiles that the U.S. and Russia have. At one point, Putin raised the possibility of extending the treaty. According to Reuters, Trump had to pause to ask his aides, what is the New START Treaty, according to sources from Reuters. And then the president told Mr. Putin the treaty was one of several bad deals negotiated by the Obama administration, saying that New START favored Russia. Does this tell us anything significant going forward, or does this just more clearly highlight the kind of relationship that we figured President Trump and Vladimir Putin might have had?
You can't, first of all, a lot of these readouts that we're getting from these calls between President Trump and the world leaders, some of them have a grain of truth, and then that gets blown into something that we understand might have not been, taken out of context or something like that. And just because President Trump said on the call, oh, this was a bad deal, we don't know at this point if he has a full understanding, of what the treaty means, although I was told he was briefed, in the last several weeks about the treaty, or if that's just a negotiating tactic that he says to President Putin to kind of, start off with a little bit of leverage. Look, the 6th anniversary of the START Treaty was last week on February 5th. At that time, the State Department put out some, kind of statement or guidance that was praising the treaty and said the U.S. is committed to the treaty. And that language was approved by the White House. So if the White House really thought, and that was a matter of policy, that was a bad deal, they didn't tell President Trump. So I kind of think it's going to be really a challenge for us to separate, some of the tweets and some of the things that President Trump says off the cuff as opposed to what the U.S. policy is going to be moving forward. It's very challenging, I admit, but sometimes the policies don't match up to what President Trump says that he thinks at any given time.
Wonder if we could squeeze in one more quick question. Or I'm sorry, Anne, did you want to chime in on Russia?
Very quickly, yeah.
Briefly, we're up against a break in a second.
Okay, I was in Russia in the early 90s as a correspondent. I think one of the things that's coming out, though, is that Vladimir Putin is a representative of the way that Russia thinks long-term about things. We have a president who, at least as far as we know, seems to calculate quite short-term. So no wonder they have a slightly different conversation about stuff like START treaties. Of course, it would be marvellous if he'd said, no, actually, I'd like to go back to SALT II or some ancient treaty. But he didn't do that because it's just not the way he is.
Well, there's much more for us to discuss in the global edition of the Friday News Roundup with Elise Labott of CNN, Anne McElvoy of The Economist, and Mark Mazzetti of The New York Times. I'd like to talk a little bit about Europe and the elections going on there. There was a big story in Kenya about the world's largest refugee camp. A number of other topics to talk about. Get in touch with us with your questions. 1a@wamu.org. Comment on Facebook or tweet us at 1a. We're back in a minute. Stay close.
Integrating refugees and migrants into Germany's workforce has been challenging. Now, an online job portal is connecting them with companies that need their specific skill sets.
It's not easy to live as a refugee, and now I have my own job and I can afford my life.
I'm Robert Siegel. That story this afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
And from Cancer Treatment Centers of America, offering immunotherapy and other personalized treatment options to address patients' individual needs. More about precision cancer treatment at cancercenter.com. From Baird, employee-owned and independent, Baird has kept clients' financial interests first since 1919. rwbaird.com has more information. And from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, which supports NPR's health blog, Shots. More information can be found at moore.org.
Before we get back to our conversation, we would love your help with a program we're working on next week about country music. Next to pop, country is the nation's most popular genre, and many of its artists have found crossover success. So if you're a fan, this question is for you. If you had to convince someone to give country music a chance by playing one song for them, what song would you play and why? Leave us a voicemail. 855-236-1037. 1A, 1A. If you had to convince someone to give country music a chance by playing just one song for them, what would you play and why? By the way, don't play the song in your message. We can mix this song in ourselves. Trust me, it'll sound better on the radio if we do it. 855-236-1A, 1A. That's 855-236-1212. You can also make a voice memo with your smartphone and email it to 1A@WAMU.org. We'll play some of your suggestions this Monday on 1A. Back now to the global edition of the Friday News Roundup with Ann McElvoy of The Economist, Mark Mazzetti of The New York Times, and Elise Labott of CNN. Let's shift gears to Kenya now. The High Court in Kenya blocked the Kenyan government's bid to close the world's largest refugee camp, a directive to shut the Dadaab camp and forcibly repatriate more than 250,000 Somali refugees was issued last year. The order blocks that for now. There seems to be an axis with this as it relates to not only refugees, but also the war on terror. What's the impact there?
Well, it's a issue that the Kenyan government has been concerned with for some time. There's this sprawling camp near the Somali border filled with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Somali refugees. The Kenyan government sees it as a breeding ground for and a recruiting ground for Shabab, which is the Somali terror group that has launched attacks in Kenya, sometime with deadly effect, including the Westgate bombing several years ago in Nairobi. So there is the concern in the Kenyan government that you have this terrorism problem right on its border. The Kenyan government is trying to build a wall along the border. Sounds familiar. Mm-hmm. And this at a time when Shabab, the terror group, has not only not gone away, but it is shown to be far more capable than it was judged to be a couple years ago, not only for attacks inside of Kenya, but also inside of Somalia. This is something that the Obama administration made a priority, was trying to go after Shabab. We'll see what the Trump administration does in terms of prioritizing the issue.
Is there any idea what happens to these refugees now?
Well, I mean, the courts have said that this is discriminatory, and they've ordered the government to not close the camp. So they have a temporary reprieve for now. There's about 250,000 or something like that. And look, it's not a great situation for them to begin with. They're not living in a terribly clean, sanitary, comfortable situation, but at least they have somewhere to be. And so, what the court said is that you can't do this. This is discriminatory against Somali refugees, and they've ordered them to keep it open.
And one add-on, of course, is that, as we learned in the last couple of weeks, Somalia is one of the countries that is on the ban for repatriation to the United States. And so presumably they would not be coming to the United States.
And as it turns out, Somalia just elected a new president on Wednesday. The ex-prime minister, Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed, is a dual U.S.-Somali citizen. And I wonder if that sends any kind of message, or is there anything that we learned from his election that tells us about where Somalia might be going from here? Well,
I mean, it's an interesting factoid, I think, that he, grew up in the United States, and he holds degrees from, SUNY New York and Buffalo, and really spent a lot of time in the United States, since when he was sent there with Somalia's foreign ministry. So he, has a lot of experience in the West. And I think what his election is showing is that Somalia does have a future. This is the first fully functioning government in a quarter century. And Somalis are very excited about this. Now, Somalis weren't able to vote in this election. This kind of group of parliamentarians had to do it in a secure building because the country is so insecure. But I think this gives Somalis a lot of hope that, it's very forward-looking, that the future is bright, and it may not be right now, but I think he signifies a bright future for Somalia.
Could I just jump in on something on refugees, because I think it links to the conversation that we're having both in Europe and America about where events and developments are leaving refugee programs. If you look at something like that standoff in Kenya. It really is symptomatic of the fact that we have neither a commitment now. If you look back to those commitments in the early 1990s, refugee protection regimes were supposed to basically be consolidated in a way that stable states would kind of look after them. Increasingly, we're seeing less stable states withdraw from that. At the same time, we have a lot of countries, America is clearly in the lead at this at the moment, who are defining themselves by not taking refugees. So we are getting into a situation where we really don't know what a refugee is even technically supposed to do in the world, let alone who is going to take on the financial burdens. It's something the UN is going to have to revisit, I think, in very short order.
Let's back up a bit. We got a question on Syria from Michael in Indianapolis. Michael wanted to know, what is the panel's view of the declaration by the Kurds in Syria of a self-governing zone?
I think that's highly unlikely. I mean, look, like we've talked about, there are these jockeying for positions in Syria. The Turks are never going to allow that to happen because they think that this is just akin to a separatist movement and that there'll be a separatist state on the Turkish border. The question is, where do the Kurds fall out with the administration, with Assad? Does Assad at some point, in order to get their acquiescence, give them a little kind of something along the border? I think that would cause a lot of consternation with the Turks. I can't see the U.S. or the Russians letting that happen. But what do you think?
Right, certainly. And this goes back to the beginning of the discussion we had about the complicated dynamics between the United States and Turkey, right? So the Kurdish fighters have been the sort of the most accomplished fighters for the United States, the proxy fighters for the United States in both Iraq and Syria, and so and this angers Erdogan to no end. So that the Kurdish issue is something that the Turks have been dealing with a long time, and it'll remain a sore spot.
Let's shift gears to Europe and talk about the UK. There was a bit of a, I'm learning this British word, row. There was a bit of a row in Parliament. I have a British boss, so I'm learning all kinds of British words now. There was a bit of a row.
Coming on very well.
Bit of a row.
Thank you. There was a bit of a row in Parliament this week over whether or not President Trump would be allowed to speak to Parliament. The Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, has the power to rebuke politicians for using unparliamentary language. His job is to keep decorum, set the standard for what's seen to be appropriate behavior for lawmakers. Well, this week, he made it clear that he would not invite the president to address the House of Commons because he accused the president of being racist and sexist and having little respect for an independent judiciary. Here's him explaining his logic before the House of Commons this week.
We value our relationship with the United States. If a state visit takes place, that is way beyond and above the pay grade of the Speaker. However, as far as this place is concerned, I feel very strongly that our opposition to racism and to sexism and our support for equality before the law and an independent judiciary are hugely important considerations in the House of Commons.
Now, Anne McElvoy, I would love to get your opinion on this, but we did get a question from our audience asking whether or not it might be better to allow Trump to speak. The listener wrote, they are a raucous group, and that will give them the opportunity to boo him off the podium.
I think that would be certainly what would happen. I mean, it is an unusual intervention by the Speaker. The Speaker is really responsible for keeping order in the chamber, not for deciding who gets to come and speak. Relatively few foreign guests do get to address the Commons. It is usually seen as a bit of a mark of honour, so you could see why, particularly given the fact there's very strong feeling in many quarters, a negative feeling about Donald Trump, you might not want to extend that. But it would be difficult, I think. He is going to come on this state visit, whether people like it or not. To say that he's not going to address Parliament would put him very much out of line. President Obama has addressed the Parliament. Angela Merkel has addressed the Parliament. Number 10, Theresa May, I will not be too pleased to have been told by the Speaker of Parliament, a relatively junior job when it comes to the government hierarchy, who she is supposed to have speak in Parliament. But it does show, doesn't it, that this visit, when it happens, is going to be very high octane indeed and very, very divided. The warm welcome, I think, is going to be tested.
I think we have to wait and see what happens between the U.S. and the U.K. over the next several months. And I won't predict 100% that he doesn't end up addressing Parliament, but if he sees that there is a lot of consternation, he may not want to get booed off the stage, and he may not do it. Don't forget that during the campaign, that people in the UK said if he wins, he should, or he wanted to come on the visit, remember, to Scotland, and there was a lot of protest to him even at that time. So clearly he's a very divisive figure in the UK to start, and Anne is right. Presidents and other world leaders have addressed Parliament, not so early in their term, though.
And there were a number of leaders elsewhere in Europe, including in Ireland, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who made it clear that this man does not speak for the values that we espouse. So we're not sure what we're going to do with him if the Americans were to elect him.
So it doesn't really seem as if the British people are really happy that he was invited so early. Even though obviously the U.S. and U.K. have that quote-unquote special relationship that is still supposed to be special. But I'll use another British word. This really puts the Queen in a model because...
A model?
Because
I'm learning all kinds of words today.
She's the one that officially offers the invitation, and there's a lot of pomp and circumstance with the palace surrounding the visit of a president. And so I think, Anne could speak to this more, but certainly that will also be very controversial when at Buckingham Palace he's treated to all that pageantry.
Yeah, I don't think the Queen, who's counted a few of them in and counted them out again, I think she's probably biting her lip, but she can cope with it. I mean, she had the Ceausescu's over. I don't think it went terribly well, but I don't think she'd be thrilled about it. But it does seem to be the play that Theresa May is making, that she believes in talking to Donald Trump. It does cut to the heart of an argument. Some people say to continue business as usual between London and Washington, the rest of the world and Washington, is normalising an abnormal presidency. It is a very strongly held position, but there is another view, which is, we have to have continuity in affairs. Donald Trump will come and one day he will go. And that the idea that simply throwing rotten tomatoes or sulking is going to make that much difference to how long Donald Trump remains president. People have to be careful that they don't mistake their own views for the continuity of relationships between countries.
I'm Joshua Johnson. You're listening to 1A. We got a comment on our website about France as we wrap up the hour. The listener asked, if France elects Marine Le Pen, it will be the final cap in Putin's string of successes and probably lead to the breakup of the EU, a real catastrophe. In fact, I wonder if the scandal around François Fillon that has almost knocked him out was because of more Russian hacking. Now, let me give a little bit of context for this. The presidential election is coming up in France. Right now, it seems a lot less steady than it did maybe a week ago. François Fillon had been the leading presidential candidate. And now there are allegations from a French newspaper, Le Canard d'Enchaîné, that he made payments of nearly €1 million in public funds to his own wife and kids. It seems like this is shaking up the presidential election somewhat and could make it easier for Marine Le Pen, who is a far, far right candidate, to maybe become the next president of France.
There's a comment just made about normalizing an abnormal presidency. Maybe increasingly these don't become abnormal presidencies. If, as you point out, you see Marine Le Pen and her bid to become the next president of France, there is something here that is not just related to the United States. It's going on in Europe. This populist movement, whatever you want to call it, is striking a nerve with people, and it's having resonance.
And it's being fueled by Russia. Okay, you saw that Russia has actually provided money to Marine Le Pen, and you saw, we were also reading that the UK defense minister said that the Russians were trying to weaponize information for for the UK election, and you've seen that, the supporters or advisors of President Trump have also kind of leaned in the direction of some of these movements. President Trump had supported the whole idea of Brexit. And, look, Breitbart, who used to be run by Steve Bannon, the chief White House strategist, is now opening bureaus in Paris and Berlin in advance of these elections to kind of, in their words, pull a redo of what they did at Brexit when they supported that. So this is
I
being
really am going
aided
to
by
disagree
Russia.
on that last point, because I think the idea that people voted for Brexit in provincial parts of Britain because they were somehow in touch with Steve Bannon's machine, or indeed what President Putin thought about it, is a pretty poor excuse for a failure of the government to win an argument.
No. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that it's supported. It's not, it wasn't the result of, but I am just pointing out that it's supported by these, populist movements, and also that Russia is on board with that, just like they supported President Trump.
Absolutely. Back to the Cold War, isn't it? There's barely a bad cause out there that the Kremlin isn't supporting in some guise, but we have to get better at contending with it.
So it seems like this might just be Russia pushing a wave of populism or
riding the wave, maybe, and encouraging the wave, I guess.
Yeah. And not just in France and Britain, but also in Hungary and Italy. Austria. I believe the Netherlands has an election coming up. So a number of European countries where elections are coming up.
So we will go, we will see how abnormal this is, and we will see whether there are more elections like the election of President Trump in these very important elections in Europe coming up.
By the way, Anne, one quick question before we run out of time. A listener asked us if there was a petition by folks in the UK requesting that President Trump not speak there briefly. But do you know anything about a formal petition?
There's certainly a large petition saying that he shouldn't come at all. I'm sure that there will be an offspring of that, saying if he comes, he shouldn't speak in Parliament. I think people who are that worked up tend to not want him to come at all. And what happens in the parliamentary estate tends to perhaps concern MPs more than the rest of the public.
Gotcha. That's Anne McElvoy, senior editor of The Economist and editor of Economist Radio. Anne, thanks for spending the hour with us.
Thank you for having me.
Mark Mazzetti, Washington Investigations editor of The New York Times and author of The Way of the Knife, The CIA, A Secret Army, and a War at the Ends of the Earth. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And Elise Labott, Global Affairs correspondent for CNN. Thank you, Elise.
Thank you.
Remember to send us your best one song to convince someone to give country music a try. 855-236-1A1A or email 1A@WAMU.org. 1A comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for listening. This is 1A.